I wanted to start off, I thought maybe I would just really quickly I'm going to throw out some terms that maybe I always get stopped by when I'm speaking to people to just define them a little bit. And so you'll know what I'm talking about. But there's often I'll use the term prehistoric, and that's a pretty relative term depending on where you are around the world. But for us in the Great Basin, prehistoric archaeologists generally are referring to the period before Europeans and before many of the modern native cultures were in the Great Basin. Prehistoric generally refers to cultures who are no longer here, the ancestral Puebloans, the Fremont people, ancient foragers who lived on the landscape, who first came here after the ice allowed them to. And so that's what I'm referring to when I say prehistoric. It's a pretty loose term. This is in opposition to a term I also use that is ethnographic, which is a term that we often use at the museum to define modern native cultures. So those cultures that are alive and flourishing today, and who may or may not have been related to those who were on the landscape 10,000 years ago. We don't really know what their relationships were. So those two terms I'll bounce back and forth between. And then the term foragers, obviously, are people, both modern cultures and prehistoric cultures, who scour the landscape for a living and take advantage of the resources, both animal and plant, to survive in our harsh landscape of the Great Basin. So those are just some terms I'll throw out. So I didn't want you to be confused from the beginning. But to start at the beginning, my presentation is about, it's about Great Basin use of plant fiber in the prehistoric period. And I usually my research focuses on the Holocene, the early to mid Holocene period. These are the first people who came to this area and were remarkable in their ability to survive on our landscape. And I've always wanted to be an archaeologist. I started interning at the museum in 2006 and in anthropology, and was just electrified by the collections there. One of the parts of the assemblage that they have there that caught my eye were those things that were made out of plants. The plant fiber. I like to spin and knit. I love handwork. Maybe that was what attracted me to it. But I was attracted to these particular artifacts, as opposed to some archaeologists will specialize in stone tools. Some archaeologists specialize in ceramics. I wanted to specialize in plant materials and the things that people made out of them, like baskets and other really important tools that they needed to survive, such as hunting nets, hunting snares. And these are incredibly important to their survival. So these are just some pictures of a few of the many objects that they have in the collections at the Natural History Museum. And we're lucky to have these assemblages that have come specifically from the Great Basin, because we have wonderful caves, deep limestone caves that were left by the receding shores of the Lake Bonneville. And humans found these caves right away as soon as they came into our area sometime around 10,000 years ago. And these caves were cold and dry, and they allowed for the preservation of plant-based artifacts, which really doesn't happen in many places in the world at all. So we're very lucky that we have these objects that have been recovered from this area. So it's a very unique assemblage from numerous cave sites around the Great Basin, specifically the old Bonneville shoreline. As I started working with the collections there, I fell in love with some of the artistry of some of this and the skill it took to make some of these objects. You can see the basket fragment there, the netting that is so fine. And I've thrown some samples in there of some of the plant fibers that they were made of. And I noticed that these materials were often used, the tools were made almost always out of the same particular plant fiber. And I noticed patterns. Baskets were almost always made out of Roost trilobata or salix. And let me move this forward once. Yeah, here's some of the species I was particularly drawn to looking at. And you'll recognize a lot of these names. They're very common. Dogbane, the milkweed, sagebrush, juniper, bitterbrush, sourberry, and coyote willow. These are repeatedly found throughout the collections. in the forms that you see there. And it's remarkable because the collections span over 10,000 years. And so if you can imagine this deep history and this numerous artifacts made from these same materials and repeatedly over time, I couldn't understand the pattern. I didn't know why they would continue to use the same materials. So you can see here, I've sort of compiled the recovered numbers of objects from various archaeological sites. That 42BO385 or the 42SV, those are numbers for archaeological sites in our state. The BO refers to box elder, SV is severe. You can get the county acronym there. So those are all Utah archaeological sites that had numerous fragments of plant materials from tools, and they repeatedly were racking up the same, made out of the same material, same species. So there was very little variation in what people were using over time. These are the archaeological sites that I decided to look at. And they're all in the they're all in the Utah Museum collections. That's Danger, or no, I don't know what cave that is, down at the bottom corner. That's Black Rock or something. And these sites are quite large. Some of them are huge, and the strata that was excavated in some of them was quite deep. Danger Cave, for example, Hog Up Cave, had strata that was cut through by archaeologists as they studied them, that was sometimes 12 to 13 feet deep. And this is remnants of people and animals who used these sites. So they're rich, full of artifacts. And these are the dates we're talking about 10,000 to roughly 10,000 to 3,000 years ago. So I wanted to ask this question for my research. How can we explain the patterning, the regular use of specific species for specific tools over such a long span of time? Why were they choosing them? And I was drawn to them because probably they were sort of underdogs of the research area. They're not glamorous like stone tools or projectile points or anything like that. They're not sexy like hunting tools, even though they are hunting tools. Some of these things are. I also was intrigued by the fact that maybe plant material might have been connected more towards women's work, such little as we know that they did, but likely women may have been more associated with gathering plant materials and the daily maintenance of daily foods for their families, while men may have gone after larger, more dangerous quarry. So that was an attractant to me. So I wanted to know what could explain these patterns. And so I established a research plan that would involve experimental processing of the actual fibers themselves, because I like working with my hands, and would also utilize ethnographic resources, which are, we're lucky we have a lot of, some of them are quite old, documented studies and observations of modern foragers. Some, of course, these of course can be 100 years old, and how they lived on the landscape. And so we're lucky to have some of those different groups, the Paiute or the Ute or the Navajo, and how they use these plants. They still use, some of them still use these plants. So there was some knowledge there to tap. And then the last thing the last two things I wanted to do was get some mechanical engineering data about the fibers, which I'll get into more. And then I needed to model the differences. I just decided to use an optimization model, which is a simple way of just saying a cost benefit model, to see what that it's a good way to reduce complicated data into more simple terms. So that was the model I chose to use. So plant fiber itself, I love microscopes. I love microscopy. I could geek out on my microscope for hours. The plant fiber is found, the plant fiber that was used in the Great Basin and that I was looking at all comes from dicots. And there's no seed or leaf fiber in the collections. It's all from stems and bark that were used by the prehistoric people. And the plant fiber comes from the tissues of many different plants. And they all have different cellular structure. Most of them all have the cells laying in a longitudinal fashion. and that makes them useful for making long items like cordage. And then some of these plants also have modern uses. I'm trying to think, such as, well, hemp, for example, has modern uses, and they're used in composite materials now, for example, in our cars or things to make lightweight, strong materials. So you can kind of see where the fiber lays within sort of a stem, and it would have to be extracted by foragers. So I had to learn how to do that. It was fun. So the particular species I'm after, of course, I'm sure you are all familiar with, are Opossum and Asclepias, both of which are harvested in the fall after their leaves fall down, and their stalks are dry. You want to pick them before they are mushy, before they sort of decompose for the season. These two plants I noticed were used primarily in snares and hunting nets. Roost trilobata and Salix exigua are, of course, really common too. Roost is one of my favorite plants in the whole world. These are materials that were primarily used for making baskets. The first year branches were used primarily because they're flexible and strong, and they were harvested in the wintertime after their leaves had fallen. Then sage, juniper, and Persia also, or cliff rose. The bark from these plants is used a lot. It's present in the collections for many things, cordage especially. Sometimes it's just found in bundles and or large braids used for many other uses besides cordage, for kindling or for padding inside of moccasins or padding inside of cradle boards. This was the go-to soft bark material that people used a lot. It was used all year round because it was available all year round. So I wanted to try to get to understand what the strategies were that foragers were following as they selected fiber on the landscape in order to make these tools. And we needed to understand the time cost to prepare the fiber and the benefits that people would get from that fiber. Mainly I had to choose something, so I chose tensile strength. So how much strength do you get for however much time you have on hand to put into your project, into the tool that you're making? I assumed that ancient foragers, wanted to economize their time and their effort. Being, modern humans like us, that's our impulse. We're designed like that from evolution. Efficient tool design is, I'm assuming that an efficient tool will contribute to better survival. And that led me to create design a program or a research program that involved experimental archaeology and engineering at the same time. Experimental archaeology is a fun way to try to wrap our heads around a puzzle that someone long ago tried to answer a question: why did they do something this way? And because we are also humans and we have all the same equipment that they did, the brain, the hands, it's fun to jump in and try to understand, try to take something apart and understand maybe how someone long ago might have done that. And it's very insightful. And then tensile strength was my engineering, what I wanted to measure. This is sort of an interesting approach to use with humans, but it's not unusual in biological or animal or insect studies at all. These creatures all make structures. They all use extensions of their bodies somehow to make structures that are useful for their survival and that help them survive. You can see there the bees make their honeycomb, or a beaver makes a dam. Spiders are incredible engineers and have an amazing, talk about fiber that's strong. Spiders are where it's at. And I did look at a lot of spider web research in order to help with my own research. So biologists will do the same thing as I wanted to do. They'll take structures apart. They understand how and learn how they work. They understand what they're made out of. And they try to interpret all of this so that they know what the creature, what kind of forces that creature is having to contend with. How do the honeybees know, what size will be adequate to support the honeycomb? Or the spider knows how to build a they're building a web based on maybe where they're placing their nest or where they're placing their web. It depends on, the design will change depending on what kind of wind might be blowing or something. So these creatures know what forces that they're dealing with and that they have to adapt to in order to survive. And humans are the same way. So I'm assuming that our ancient humans knew what forces that they should be worried about. And I wanted to understand what those forces might be. So that would help explain the material they were choosing for their tools. When I took my samples to the engineering lab at the University of Utah, I measured 3 things. I measured stress. I wanted to explain these really quickly. Stress is just is any change in a material that's induced by stretching it. Tensile force is usually a longitudinal force, and you can have an object can be weak or it can be strong. And we experience this every day in our lives. We have materials that we know, oh, that rubber band isn't going to, isn't very strong, or you can snap something accidentally because you broke it through applying too much tensile strength. Strain is actually a measurement of how a material stretches and how it resists being stretched, amazingly. Some material will be brittle and it retains the energy of the stretching, and then it will may snap. Materials that are ductile or will stretch and give until maybe they stretch out. So again, we know from our daily lives that we have materials like this that we deal with every day. Modulus is the combination or the balance of both stress and strain that measures how a material handles the energy of being put under stress and strain before it breaks. So it gives us a really good snapshot of the toughness of how tough a material really is before it breaks. And you take it right up to the breaking point, and you can measure, you quantify this quality in a material. So if you can kind of think of those items that we use every day, rubber bands around the broccoli is a perfect idea, but a rubber band to perhaps use as a climbing rope is not a good idea. A climbing rope is awesome for a good climb because it is strong, but it also is dynamic and it will give a softer landing for someone who falls. You would never use a climbing rope, for example, to tow a car. You need a chain or something strong like that. So we know these things intuitively. We know already what materials that we have in our everyday life, what is really an adequate amount of tensile strength or material to use for a certain task. So I'm hoping that I was banking on the fact that foragers also knew this. When I took my samples, I took them to the engineering lab at the University of Utah. They didn't blink an eyelash. They rip things apart there and have so much fun up there. I came in with my plant samples and they thought it was really cool. So you can see the Instron machine I used there on the left-hand side. And I would string up my cordage. I made 2-ply cordage, which I'll explain a little bit more about, for all of my samples. 2-ply cordage is one of the most common forms that the fiber is found in the prehistoric sites. Cordage was needed for everything. Hunting nets were made out of cordage, snares were made out of cordage, and anything you want to tie your moccasins together or whatever was made out of cordage, usually 2-ply cordage. So that's why I chose that instead of just the plant material fiber itself. It also allowed me to make a long cord that would be workable around the Instron machine, because you can see it needs to be wound around both of those sides. And then it's slowly torn apart and it's measured. On the right-hand side, you can get an idea of what I was talking about. The modulus, the X and Y axis, is portrayed there. A plant, for example, that's strong and brittle, that has low strain and can take a high stress, will suddenly fracture. You can see that's the red line with the very steep angle, as opposed to the other two that might show a better, more balanced behavior. The green line is strong and flexible and can handle high strength and high strain. And then there's the line in yellow, of course, that's weak and flexible, that is low strength and low strain. So those are just an example of what the test was going to measure and what it might look like, what it was going to look like. To sort of explain a little bit more about what I was after, we also need to understand how the plant fiber that foragers were selecting helped them, helped their tools function better than any other plant fiber. So that if I knew that I was if they've chosen a plant fiber for a reason, it's got to be over all the others. And this is the one that they've chosen. And so I needed to understand how their tools worked. And I know that, so plant fiber handles stress in different ways. And so and materials handle stress in different ways. So I wanted to sort of show these different tools. I know I'm jumping all over the place between a climbing rope and a Native American basket, but I've put these things here to show that there's a difference between the forces that certain materials can take and that they're used for. There's a climbing rope, which is designed to take a moving force of a falling climber, for example. A snare to catch a rabbit is designed to grab something that is moving, and it can expand and still be effective. Versus a static force, which is unchanging. Baskets are an excellent example of static force. Means that we need baskets to hold their shape. They need to be stiff, and they need to be reliable for valuable resources such as water. For example, that's a Navajo water jug down in the corner. Water jugs were used throughout the Holocene amazingly, and they will hold water. Some of them were pitched, some of them weren't. They're woven so tightly, and they can hold up, some of them would hold up to 1.5 gallons of water, which is incredibly heavy. It's a remarkable invention. Then there's this winnowing basket on the left-hand side. She has something that's been ground into a flower, and it's not coming out of her weave. It's so tight. So baskets, they needed baskets to be really rigid and really to hold their shape. So it's the same with us. We don't want our egg cartons to be collapsible. We want egg cartons to hold the eggs and not, we don't want them made out of rubber. We want them made out of something a little stiffer. So they're just, again, it's something we experience in our everyday life with different materials and the tools that we use. Very quickly to run through some of the tools that we're talking about. This is a hunting net, a Paiute rabbit net on the left-hand side. Some of these hunting nets were huge. We have remnants of them in the collection. That's one of those pictures down there that looks like a little ratty thing. This is all that's left of somebody's hunting net, but it does tell us that it was part of a larger structure. We know from ethnographic research that hunting rabbits was vibrant and very valuable way to get a lot of resources. Rabbits at a certain time of the year when their fur is fluffy and their fat would be rounded up. And it's because we have these nets in our collections, we know that prehistoric people were hunting rabbits. We also have faunal remains from these archaeological sites that tell us that rabbits were an incredible resource for people for thousands of years, and they were catching them with nets. So these were usually made out of opossum and out of milkweed, out of dogbane and milkweed. They have high extensibility. They would have been really, they would have been able to catch a heavy rabbit going full speed. Jackrabbits are quite large, but it would have to be able to absorb the energy of the rabbit, but still hold it. So it had to be strong and it had to be extendable. If the net was any harder, like a trampoline, or it would trampoline that rabbit right back off, the rabbit would bounce off the net. So it needs to be able to absorb all of that rabbit's energy, but still catch him. Same thing with the snare. These are some snares in the collections. They are usually in bundles like this. They're beautifully made. The diameter of this whole collection of about 30 snares hardly changes. I mean, it's almost all of them are, 1.5 millimeters, just consistently. They're so beautifully executed. Somebody really knew what they were making, and they're on a careful roll so that when someone was out setting their traps, they could just unroll their strings of snares and quickly set up a very deadly kind of snare, which this man is showing us from a study. Just as simple, using a bent over sapling and holding it down. So there's a lot of force waiting to happen when the animal triggers that snare. And the fiber needs to be strong enough to hold the force of the branch that's snapping back and hold the force of the struggling animal until the hunter can come back and retrieve them. So this needed to be made out of a tough material. These were also made out of opossum and Asclepias. Water bottles, again, baskets for winnowing, various resources. You see this basket over in the corner is just calibrated perfectly to hold her pine nuts. So that's been created because they know the size of their resource. You wouldn't want to sift acorn flour in that basket. It would fall right through, but it's perfect for doing pine nuts. So baskets were carefully calibrated. The spacing is important, and it needs to hold that spacing. So the material it's made out of, the plant fiber it's made out of, has to be strong, and it has to be rigid and hold its shape. It's very important. You can see this lady over here in the corner is actually boiling water using hot rocks, and she's using a basket. I think this is brilliant. And it works. And she'll keep trading the rocks out every few minutes, putting it back in the fire, and then putting another red hot rock in, and you can keep a rolling boil in your basket as long as you want. So baskets had to be very tough to handle that. So these were usually, again, baskets made out of Roost trilobata and willow salix. So then my second part of my experimental archaeology was doing this myself. So I consulted a lot of sources. I've been working with my hands with plant material for a little while. I felt pretty competent in making two-ply cordage and stripping the fibers from these different different sources. So I processed bark from juniper, Persia, and sage. I needed to clean away the dirt and the dead material until it was clean. And then I made a two-ply cordage out of all these materials. Those are my hands there in the far right, making a sample that I would then rip apart on the Instron machine. For processing the stalks of Opposonum and Asclepias, you need to crush the stalk when it's dry. It remarkably breaks into four. I don't know why. And then you can easily pull the fiber away from the pith and sort of coil it up like that until you're ready to use it. Sometimes I would soften it in my hands like this a little bit, but it was mostly it was pretty pleasant to work with. I didn't cut myself; it wasn't slivery. Then the last thing to do was to process the basket material. I learned how to do this from a couple of workshops working from Navajo with Navajo basket makers. The Navajo and the Paiute and the Ute all use Roost trilobata and salix for their basketry, so they all end up processing their materials relatively similarly. So this lady is splitting the rod into three using her teeth and a pocket knife. And I learned how to do that. It took me a long time, but I felt very confident that I was taking the same amount of time that hopefully maybe a Navajo teenager might be doing, not a skilled Navajo basket maker, but at least I was in there. I was in the running. These had to be scraped and they had to be thinned. And shaped to make even stitching. So that, it all starts here. An even, well-constructed, strong basket starts with even, well-constructed basket materials. And you can see her skilled hands over here on the far left with that giant knife, trimming those materials down. As I ran the samples through the Instron machine, the output looked like, you could see this kind of funny screen here. It created, these are all my samples from one species. And it points out two important things. One, the incredible regularity and the regular characteristic of each sample. This particular, I think it was Roost, clearly shows a steep ascent in the test before it breaks. And it breaks suddenly. You can see that it maybe quivers a little bit and then boom, it snaps. So that is typical of Roost. It's very strong and it breaks really suddenly. But that's what the output looked like from the Instron machine. And that's the data that I used for each one of my samples. I did, what did I do? 7 species, I did 30 of each. So, so to come to sort of the outcome of this, I'm trying to move this screen out of the way. This is the results of the various tests that I made. And they're sort of abbreviated here. I'm sure you can remember Opposonum, Asclepias, and Persia, Artemisia, Juniper, Salix, and Roost are all on there. The ranking by, I'm trying to see, it's hiding under some of the screen commands I've got. So the ranking by, what's the one on the top there? Let's go, must be strain. Opposonum and Asclepias clearly are in a group by themselves and can clearly take more strain than any of the other species that I tested. They're remarkably elastic. And down, then you can see that Persia, that the bark materials are in the middle And then the basket materials are much more brittle, and they were not as flexible. If you look at the rankings by strength, also you can see that Opocium and Asclepius also are ranking the highest, very closely together. Roost and Salix are in the middle on strength. They're very strong. And then the bark materials are not as strong. Still strong, but they're not as strong as the others. Then looking at the rank by modulus, which is, remember, how the plant handles both of these, stretch and strain, you can see that Roost and Artemisia had the highest modulus, which means that they're the stiffest materials. They're the toughest materials. And then Asclepius and Opocium, of course, being very ductile, they're not going to be very, they're not stiff, they're not tough, but they do elongate. So you can see how these 7 fibers ranked themselves really interestingly. Let me look at the last one up here at the top. And then for stretching, Opocium and Asclepius, of course, were ranked way higher than the other materials. The other ones just sort of were down, not even anywhere near these other 2 materials. So Roost and Salix don't stretch out. Those are the ones used in basketry. And then the bark materials also didn't have much stretch. So I noticed as this data came out that what we had was 3 specifically different kinds of fibers and fiber behaviors. We had what I called type 1, which was stiff and strong, had no elongation, and it had a quick, complete break. And the 2 fibers that had that behavior were Roost trilobata and Salix exigua. These happen to also be the 2 fibers that are used for basketry. And we know that basketry probably requires a stiff and strong material that will not elongate, that will hold its shape. Then type 2 fibers are stiff, they have limited strength, limited elongation, and they have an incomplete break, which means they just sort of fizzle when they break. It was juniper, artemisia, and Persia. And these 3 were the bark materials that are often frequently used for just everyday cordage. Nothing too technical, but they were super useful, super strong. Then type 3 fibers were flexible and strong and expandable, and they had an incomplete and very slow break. So even though you were pulling it apart, it would still hang on there, even with down to just the remaining fibers, it would still fight in there to try to hang on to itself. And these 2 fibers in type 3 were Opocium and Asclepius, which were the 2 materials used for making rabbit nets and making snares. So I noticed that statistically that these materials broke down into groups according also by the technologies that they were mostly they were used for. And you can see that the output from the Instron machine of the type 1 material, you can see it's very strong and stiff. It's got a steep ascent and a quick break. And then down below that one is for type 2. It shows a moderate rise. It's very strong and moderately stiff. It fights a little bit before it breaks, and then it breaks. And then the type 3 is the example down on the far right on the bottom. You can see the long sloping ascent as it's being pulled, and then a somewhat slowish break, an incomplete break as it is finally torn apart. These are vastly different groups and vastly different fiber behaviors. So we can align the fiber types with the special material, with the special tools. Type 1 fibers have these qualities that you can see here. They also had low processing costs. That means the time it took for me to prepare them was the shortest. Amazingly, a lot of people think that it takes a long time to prepare the basket materials, and it sort of did, but not as much as it did for the others. Type 1 fibers are perfect for rigid structures, static loads, and it's suited for basketry. Type 2 fibers have moderate strength, moderate elongation, and moderate stiffness, and for low demand loads, and it's suited for general cordage and everyday use. And those are the 3 bark materials that we have there. And then the type 3 fibers showed high strength and high strain, low stiffness, meaning they're very flexible, but they also had high processing costs. It takes a long time to make these, to pull the fiber out, to create the cordage. It takes a lot of cleaning. They're not super handy. It takes a long time to extract this strong fiber. And it's really good for expandable structures and changing loads, and best suited for nets and snares. And opossum and Asclepius were type 3 fibers. So it was interesting to see that the fiber types that I was testing and the tools matched the patterns that we were seeing in the prehistoric assemblages. So I think I was onto something as I saw this patterning out after I had my test did the testing. Wow, I've kind of blazed through this. I hope we have lots of questions. In conclusion, I was able to find that strength and strain of plant fiber is important and was important to ancient foragers, and that the tool design takes advantage of these different behaviors. Nets need to expand. They need to be strong enough to hold a struggling animal that hits it at a jackrabbit can run 45 miles an hour, and it maybe weighs 8 pounds. And that's a lot of weight to hit a net that is made out of maybe a few millimeters of cordage. So that material needs to be strong, but it also needs to expand, and it needs to hold the animal. Baskets need to be rigid and hold their important and valuable resources. You don't want the water leaking out of your water basket or seeds leaking out. Foragers' fiber selections differed with the mechanical suitability. So they selected materials, hopefully, I think I'm right, selected materials that that were suitable for the particular tool that they were trying to build, and that worked for that kind of material, for that kind of tool. And that mechanical suitability means efficient tools, and efficient tools mean survival. Foragers' goals in fiber selection differ based on tool function. So depending on what the tool was that you needed it to do, and the tool you were making depended on the fiber you selected was specific to that tool function. So let me move this thing over here again. And then again, the tested species and the technologies match the patterns that we're seeing in prehistoric assemblages. The rabbit netting from all of our sites is made out of opossum and Asclepius. The snares are made out of opossum. Baskets are made out of Roost and Salix, and then general cordage, prolific cordage that was used every day was made out of the bark from juniper and sage and from Persia or cliff rose. So sorry, I jumped between the common names and the Latin names. So I hope that made sense. I was really excited when the engineering data came back and I was able to see those patterns. I think I would like to try another round of tests and include a couple more species that I didn't do this round. I think it would be important maybe to look at yucca. Yucca is used in a lot of archaeological items, but not necessarily in the Eastern Great Basin. It's used, of course, in the Four Corners area, but I would like to find out how strong yucca was and what its mechanical qualities were. That would be kind of fun. So I think that's it for my presentation.